my name is Julie, and in this video I'm going to be talking about trauma and the emotional well-being of children and young people seeking sanctuary in schools. This video is part of a set of videos for the Improving Teaching to Improve Refugee Education project. Providing a welcoming and safe space in a classroom is fundamental to meeting the emotional well-being needs of children seeking sanctuary. Being aware of the factors that might have forced a child and their family to leave their country, such as war, persecution, or natural disaster, helps to provide a context. But the most important role an educator can play is to understand their part in supporting emotional well-being needs. Teachers can help children seeking sanctuary by working with them to establish healthy relationships in a safe space. These relationships will require positive interactions, acceptance, and kindness. Schools that are already undertaking lots of work around the social and emotional aspects of learning and developing emotional literacy through whole class approaches are already really well placed to support children and young people seeking sanctuary. It's important to consider that some young people will settle in quickly and be happy, and others will take a little more time to settle. So teachers and teaching assistants need to be aware of avoiding pathologizing potential mental health problems in the children and young people that they are working with. But they still should be aware of the possible impacts that a traumatic event such as forced migration might have on a young person's emotional well-being. So being aware of the social and emotional needs of a class enables the creation of a caring environment. Ensuring all children feel that they belong and are accepted allows children to experience empowerment, respect, and recognition. Being aware of the signs of trauma is a good starting point. Trauma is the body's response to a disturbing or distressing event or events, and the body's reaction may be immediate or long-term, or it may be both. The World Health Organization explains that refugees may be at risk of poor mental health because of traumatic or stressful experiences. So many of them experience feelings such as anxiety, sadness, hopelessness. They may have trouble sleeping, they may be tired, irritable, angry, or have aches and pains. For most people, these symptoms of distress will improve over time, but longer term, they may be more at risk of depression, anxiety, and possibly post-traumatic stress disorder, more so than people in the host populations. So the role of the teacher isn't to try and probe or diagnose the difficulties that a child is experiencing. That's the role of a qualified medical professional. But just understanding a little bit about trauma is helpful. And so I'm just going to go through a basic overview. I'll begin by talking about the three different types of trauma that people experience. So the first of those is acute trauma. And acute trauma is the result of a one-off event. So for example, an earthquake or witnessing a violent event. The next type of trauma is chronic trauma. Chronic trauma can be defined as ongoing trauma that happens over a prolonged period of time. So an example of this might be a child living in an abusive environment. Complex trauma happens when chronic trauma has a marked emotional and or psychological impact on the individual. So those are the three different types of trauma. A person's brain has adapted to cope in an uncertain environment. So when someone's been through a traumatic experience, it's adapted somewhat to deal with what it's being faced with. And so when a child arrives in a quite normal environment of a classroom, the brain might find it harder to adapt in that more stable environment. And this situation leads to the child or young person having what's termed as a latent vulnerability. This means that there's an increased likelihood that the child or young person may have mental health problems in the future. This vulnerability means that new social situations may be harder to cope with, and establishing trust might be difficult. Maintaining relationships might also be hard if the person feels unsure of themselves or is stressed about a new situation. Where a child or young person has experienced threat, this might lead to hypervigilance. And so children are constantly on the eye out for any situation that might present a threat to them or a perceived threat to them. So children and young people might overreact in certain situations that seem threatening, and sometimes it might be hard for them to control their impulses. They might lash out or be overly angry. And this might lead to an impaired capacity for friendships. So any adults in the situation just need to take a step back and try to consider what the child or young person's behaviour is communicating. Taking this proactive approach to identifying any possible stressors will help and support the child or young person to manage their emotions and to develop more positive relationships. Sometimes children and young people might share their experiences with a trusted adult, and that might include teachers and/or teaching assistants. It's really important to clarify who in the school is responsible for seeking emotional and psychological support for children and families and what school procedures are. But schools also need to identify how they will support their staff that may be experiencing being told about traumatic events. Supporting children and young people seeking sanctuary is demanding on staff, and ensuring that there's support in place to meet the adults' needs is also important, because people might be experiencing secondary or vicarious trauma by hearing about some of the situations that children may have been through. Another aspect to consider in school is thinking about the curriculum. So all children and young people are different, and each have got their own different understanding of the world. And sometimes the subject of war and conflict arises in the classroom as part of day-to-day teaching. As a teacher, it's important to present information in an understandable and accessible way for all members of the class community. Where children and young people have knowledge or direct experience of war, it's really important to be mindful of this before you plan to share videos or stories or any materials that might allude to situations that children may find upsetting. Children and young people seeking sanctuary have arrived from areas maybe where there's ongoing conflict and wars, and it may be that members of their family are still living in those areas too. So it's important to be mindful of those situations, but also to be very factual about the situations that are occurring in their countries, and consider whether or not you have children from different sides of the conflict within the same class. So an example might be a new arrival from the Ukraine might be arriving in a class where there is a child who has Russian relatives, for example. So just to conclude, trauma may well have an impact on the child or young person's entire family. Taking a whole family approach to providing a sense of belonging within the school community will definitely help all members of the family and ultimately the child in the school themselves. So this is something else maybe to consider, ways that whole families may have their emotional well-being needs met. And that returns really to the point at the beginning of the video about creating welcoming and safe, inclusive and accepting environments in school communities.